friends. You are on the Military Reports channel, and today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of April 2024 year. Today there was just a huge number of events. There is an interesting geolocation of progress along the line of contact. So let's get started. But before we start discussing the situation on Earth, of course, probably the most important interesting news is coming from Romania today. Since the very morning, we have received regular footage of the transfer of equipment somewhere along Romania. In Romania towards Moldova, or possibly towards Ukraine, it is difficult to assume. But we clearly understand that something is happening. And more often, and more clearly, the future coalition, which will most likely include Moldova, Ukraine, Romania and France, is emerging as a whole. It will be 4 states, the main surrender, and the purpose of which will be to protect the regions that are ethnically connected with Romania and Moldova, including Odessa. And most likely it will be Chernivtsi, and most likely it can be something like the Carpathian region. At the same time, it is worth noting such a situation that Romania itself has already begun to discuss, or rather submitted for public, let's say, consideration, discussion, a bill on giving the right to empower the president with the representation of the prime minister on the use of Romanian troops on the territory of a foreign state in order to protect, let's say, ethnic Romanians there, or that something like that. If we look at the situation on Earth and project the situation, then we clearly understand that in Moldova itself, according to statistics, the latest data, about 600,000 people are carriers of Romanian citizenship. 600,000 people are ethnic Romanians. Ethnically, there is even more, but it has passports. If we talk about the border of Ukraine, then according to separate information, separate sources, 100,000 people have a Romanian passport. In other words, all these points can of course be used by both Romania and the NATO states, as well as the coalition of Moldova, Romania, France and Ukraine, with the aim of launching an intervention in the southwestern and western regions of Ukraine. Well, let's see how this whole interesting situation ends. Then, it is also worth paying attention to the fact that there will be US presidential elections ahead. Trump promised that he would cut as much as possible. Well, that is, there will be some questions of their own regarding assistance to Ukraine, regarding US-NATO relations. And now there are discussions on how to make sure that, in general, all assistance in Ukraine is taken out of the competence of the United States and transferred completely to the competence of NATO. That is, so that the issue is resolved at the NATO level, and the United States pays its contributions there, in the amount of a certain percentage there, and does not delve into the amount, and how this assistance will be transferred or provided to Ukraine. Well, now let's move with you to the line of combat contact. Today, there is a lot of news, and it is even difficult to guess. It is difficult to understand where it is best to start. But we will start with you today, of course, with the Belagorsky direction. If we talk about the situation in general, about geolocation, then as you can see, there are a small number of them. There is some kind of blow was struck in the area of Nikolaevka, in the area of the settlement of Slavyansk, as a result of which the point of dislocation was destroyed or hit. In general, nothing serious. There is some artillery activity in the area of Zalesnyansky. The armed forces of the Russian Federation inflicted artillery strikes on positions in the forest, in the fields. That is, in principle, nothing significant either, but of course there are several geolocations from the area of Bologorovka itself. The armed forces of the Russian Federation are clearing positions, both along the Seversky Donetsk River and in the dump itself. But you can say this, but what is serious here, what is interesting here? Let me remind you, just before we move on to the main part, that yesterday we discussed with you how the Russian army struck its blow by passing the quarry, by passing the chalk dump from the Zolotarevka side, by approximately this route. We came to the conclusion that most likely the Russian army had as its main goal entering this forest, which is located south of Bologorovka, in order to consolidate and in general establish and create a stable bridgehead in this form, south of Bologorovka and southwest of the chalk dump itself. That is, in case of successful development, the creation of this bridgehead, then an instant threat of encirclement, an instant threat of a complete bypass of the front 80 positions of the 81st 54th Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine is formed. But the most interesting thing is that we wondered for a long time, could not understand what happened, whether we managed to gain a foothold, whether we managed to achieve something, and so on and so forth. And today all our questions were answered by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, which reported that it was in the area of Bologorovka that the armed forces of the Russian Federation first of all managed to improve their positions. In the second moment, they managed to recapture 10 counterattacks launched by the 81st Airmobile and the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade in the area of the settlements of Belogorskivka and Berestovoye. That is, as far as I understand, there are no Gonoskads, there are only some crazy statistics from the Ministry of Defense. 10 counterattacks cleanly in a day. That is, I understand that after all this is really a complete speculation on my part, but based on the reports, based on the latest geolocation, it can be concluded that the armed forces of the Russian Federation still managed to drop into this forest located south of Bologorovka. Perhaps there was a process of consolidation. Over the past day, the Ukrainians, with the use of the 81st Brigade in those hills, have already counterattacked the positions of the Russian army 10 times. This is actually a very large indicator. This is a very large indicator. It is quite rare that counterattacks with such intensity are high, but apparently there was an understanding that perhaps strategic positions were lost, which in general, in the future, with further consolidation, could lead to the collapse of this front. Therefore, the counterattack yesterday was simply godless. That is, in the direction of Belogorskivka, and it turns out that the Melitopol is south, to the west, and the 10th Mountain Assault was reported on the counterattacks. Here is the 10th Mountain Assault, and in the direction of the settlement of Birch Bark. That is most likely, as we discussed with you recently, fierce battles were fought, which is very, very high intensity power, in the area of the Vyemka railway station, and most likely the Russian troops managed to improve their positions in their position somewhere here in the fields during the next assault. It is possible to take another lane, take another trenches, another self-defense there, after which the APU also tried to counterattack. In general, according to the result of these battles over the past day in this direction, the armed forces of Ukraine have lost a total of 390 people killed, wounded, 21 pieces of equipment for artillery installations in the Donetsk direction. In other words, very serious battles are being fought here, and in the near future, most likely, well, I think we will have a denouement along Bologorovka until the end of this week, and it will become clear whether we have managed to gain a foothold and what will happen next in this direction. I remind you, if it is possible to gain a foothold and bring down the bridgehead of Bologorovka, then immediately under threat, and under the threat of a collapse of the encirclement, such groups in the forest will fall, as in the Serebryansky forestry. Verkhnotoretskaya, it is unclear what will begin here, and it is unclear in which direction they will have to retreat. Let's hook up with you at the same moment, at the same minute, the situation in the estuary area, or the South Kapinsky direction. Footage from the AFU is being published again. We have repeatedly discussed this direction with you. Let's say, if we increase the number of updates again from the 1st of March, then we see the situation here developing extremely not in favor of the Russian Federation, although if it's interesting, it's worth noting that rolls are regularly made, offensives are regularly made, but the only thing we don't see here in this direction of the country of the Russian Federation is a counter-battery struggle and the counter-Ifpirin of the struggle. That is, it is not visible. That is, it is being published. A very small number of frames were published. How it is possible to identify certain artillery positions, destroy them, and so on. But at the same time, it is constantly present. New shots are published on a regular basis from the side of the highly regular roll. Here, for example, another video has been published here, as the Russian army as part of a huge tank column, with the use of a large amount of equipment, on these frames can be approximately counted, perhaps in the region of 10 units, tried to move towards the thorns under heavy artillery fire, with a very dense blow. We will not watch the video until the end, but I assume that you have an understanding of how this offensive ended in the end. In principle, well, it wasn't quite possible, although perhaps these shots were published from the outside in the USU, and I can't say for sure whether they managed to fight back or not, but from the frames it can be made that the offensive was heavy. Let's describe it in these words. Of the interesting things in the Kopinski direction, it is worth noting that today the footage of the arrival of the 500th Fab was published somewhere at the command post of the 3rd Assault Azov Brigade, or simply, well, which in my opinion, is already present in every section of Ukraine. And in particular, in the morning, the news came that the direction of Svatov was stirring, or rather, most likely it is more precisely west of Svatov, and just before I started recording the video, information was received that the matchmaking cry direction in the direction of the village of Stilmakovka was making progress. Russian troops took 2 landings. And here is the settlement of Stilmakovka. This is the direction where, literally until recently, military operations were carried out north of the Krakmelny settlement in the direction of Sandy Berestovo. But today it is already in the area of Stilmakovka. What is worth noting here is interesting for the same march in this direction. Then during March, one very interesting, important footage was published. Most likely it turns out it destroyed a damaged bridge, or that it was given to restore, and a little to the north. Footage was published during March. Here are some maps, shots from the 1st of March of a destroyed bridge in this direction, and a little to the north. Shots from the 14th of March, also a missile strike or something like that, and also a destroyed bridge. That is, during March, the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine in this direction were so nobly battered. Literally a month later, 2 weeks after those events, the fighting begins here. Well, let's see where it leads. Then, we are moving to the Bakhmut-Artemovsky direction, from where a very large amount of information also comes. All information, of course, about the village of Chaz Yar, and about the village of Ivanovsko. What is interesting here, what is worth paying attention to? Sources report, well, unfortunately, it was not possible to find this on the maps. I was trying to make out, maybe some shadow would be visible or something like that. It is reported that the Russian troops managed to get there, or rather, it is located 100 meters from the sign of the Yar clock. That is, 100 meters, the sign of the Yar clock, is already even the locality itself. And it is reported that the distance to the advanced positions is already 600 meters or less. That is, but the Russian fighters have already come very close to this direction. It is reported that the last day was mainly the Russian command, the gunners were concentrated, the destruction of all logistics, crossings, breakage, destruction of all communication routes, evacuation, pickup, and so on and so on, from the western part of the Yar clock to the eastern part. But there are no active combat operations on assault measures in this direction yet were undertaken. But this is how everything is boiling up so much that it seems to be about to start. Yes. In particular, more details were published today about this interesting place in the area of, say, forests south of the Yar clock. Sources report that it turns out to be some kind of old base, a military base. The largest fortified area, a whole fortress, has been built here in the forest, and sources assure that it was in this area, in this base, in March, as a result of another strike. If you remember, a Polish general was hit, who remained right in these forests, in these trenches and beyond, yes. And well, during March, they also published footage of the same strike later. According to Ivanovsky, what is interesting? There we are. Remember, according to the last geolocations that we had back in March, the approximate advance of the Russian army somewhere ended at the level of Tereshkova and Zarakhnaya. When, let's say, the footage from this place was already published, information from the Ministry of Defense came from this area, that the city was completely cleared. However, the geolocations have not been confirmed. There was no confirmation of this. And today, the armed forces of Ukraine have published footage of assault operations, the offensive of the Russian army. This is such a cutting, a vinaigrette of different dates, different places, different street corners, and the settlement of Ivanovskaya, not only, and the surrounding area. And in general, there is a large amount of damaged equipment, attacks, fires, discharges, that is, well, everything they could have collected a vinaigrette for March, April, and posted in one video. But in general, if we analyze this offensive by episodes, then one of the episodes took place somewhere in this direction in the area of Bakhmut-Vodo. In other words, the first geolocations really appeared, confirming full control over the settlement itself. Moreover, the published individual cartographers are already publishing information about the further advance of the Russian army, and that during the offensive, it was possible to enter the forest located west of the settlement of Ivanevsk. That is, if we sum up all these moments, all these assumptions there, at the moment the Russian army has entered the forest, into this piece, and now fighting is underway here in the direction of the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. These fights will be, well, it's not difficult to say how much, how long they will last, but in any case, for some time. And already with the release of the channel, of course, a completely different story will begin. That is, at least, the unified defense system will already be cut into two parts. The channel will be on its own. Kleshivka will be on its own, and there may already be an increase in hostilities in Kleshivka. Well, that is, it will most likely lead in parallel. Two assault operations will be conducted. Then we go to the Avdiivka direction, from where a large amount of information also comes. We will start with you from the Berdik-Orlovka-Semenov-Kamenskaya line. And we will probably start with Berdik from the northern direction. Here, if we remember, we discussed the situation in the western part with you, just as we told you yesterday. We discussed a video of a strike using a multiple launch rocket system, where a possible arrival of a Grad missile was recorded from the Russian positions. A very big discussion. A lot of controversy. Some cartographers claim that this has already been completely cleared of the territory. Others say that there was a breakthrough. Third, saying that there was a breakthrough, but they began to doubt. They began to say that there had already been attempts at a counteroffensive with the Viso. That is, preparing the ground in case Russian troops were somehow forced to retreat in telegram channels. Well, in other words, some interesting situation begins. But in general, no information has been received from here today about the final control, let alone the western part. But of the interesting things, it's worth paying attention to this video. This video is published, here are the Berdiks, here it turns out the fields, here is a piece in the lower left corner, if you can see. This is the area that, according to yesterday's controversy, discussions managed to enter the Durga of the Russian Federation, and strikes are being carried out using multiple launch rocket systems, right in the same place. Here came the mushrooms, explosions, blast waves. Here are the results of the blows. In other words, we see with you that yesterday there were Grads a little in this place, now a little to the northwest. That is, there is no exact information yet, but everything again fits and converges, and on the whole, dances according to one story, that then the same units struck a little to the southeast, now a little to the northwest. But in any case, it is difficult to draw any conclusions yet. It is reported that the fields in the Berdik area have been completely cleared, and an operation is underway to clean up and secure them. Well, we will watch, we will wait to see how this whole story ends, but in any case, Berdik's days, we must clearly understand, are already numbered. The only question is, has it already happened yesterday, or in a day or two? A little to the north in the Osheretino area, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, during reconnaissance activities, managed to identify another Apu warehouse at the junction of the railway intersection, and as a result of the strike, the warehouse was destroyed, and we see a secondary detonation, a fairly significant explosion. Yes, a simple military routine in the direction. More details are received from us in the direction of Thin Uman. Of interest, it is worth noting that south of the Durna River, the Russian troops managed to completely gain a foothold, clean up and in fact, reduce the front line. The line is currently running along the river. There is a unification of the lines between Berdik and Orlovka, that is. Everything here is already under the control of the Russian army. I'm so sure it is. Perhaps we won't even wait for geolocation, because in general it is logical. Well, maybe there is a gray zone here, since it is difficult to approach the coastline, since there is immediately a blow from the other side of the river. At the same time, information is being received that the Russian troops, some cartographers assure, have managed to advance along the same Durna River and have already overcome, so to speak, the reservoir, or the Pansky Stavka, or whatever it is called. That is, in general, if we sum up all the assumptions. Approximately this picture is currently present in the human direction. In other words, there is a bridgehead on the Ukrainian side and so on. But there are already problems behind this rate of the pan. Here the fortifications already begin in the direction of Uman itself, freshly dug, ready to repel the offensives of the Russian Federation. If we talk about Pervomayskaya, then today, according to separate cartographers, there was a complete cleaning of Embankment Street, which is located north of the old Avdiivsky Rate, the old Avdiivsky Reservoir. A complete cleaning of this part of Pervomayskaya Street. Persharavnova Street has not yet received information about a complete cleaning. In other words, there are probably still fighting going on here. But again, this is today's question of time. And to the west of Pervomaysky, another system was discovered and destroyed, another artillery installation in the forest, somewhere in the area of Karlovka. The installation was destroyed using, say, an accurate Krasnopol projectile. Here he flies, here he arrives the target, here to destroy. It is worth noting that over the past day, over the past weeks, months, quite often, the Russian leadership, the Russian military published exactly the result and the very use of this, let's say, Krasnopol supply. And it can be noted statistics that these shells have been used much more often and much more effectively. According to Krasnogorovka, there is a small adjustment on the map, and here the footage has been published. According to Russian sources, it was possible to detect the control point of the Wolv. This video was shot on the 1st of April, that is, not yesterday, not the day before yesterday, but the 1st of April, or rather the day before yesterday. And according to these frames, it was possible to detect a Wolv point in this place. It was destroyed with the help of an artillery strike. That is, it is possible according to indirect data. According to the data, let's say the video can be indirectly, the indirect topic of the proof can be assumed that the Russian troops were forced to roll back completely from the southern part of Krasnogorskovka, since it is unlikely that someone will set the position of Wolves and drones so close directly to the Russian positions, to the positions under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. In other words, there is an extremely high probability that this section of the front line is either in the gray zone or under control in the forest. While we do not touch the map, we are waiting for big news, some news updates. Then, we will think and decide what to do next. To the west of Marinka, a counter-battery struggle is being waged between Kurikovoye and Novomikhailovka. And again, everything is being destroyed quite accurately with the use of the same Krasnopol, the same Lancets. The Russian army is currently conducting counter-battery duels quite effectively. At least, the footage of the destroyed artillery is published every day, and in large numbers, right? But in principle, this is not surprising. If we talk about Novomikhailovka, then there is marked progress, further progress. There are separate maps, shots of the capture of a large number of armed soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine. In the area of Novomikhailovka, artillery strikes are being carried out in the village itself in the western part. In general, according to the geography of artillery strikes, it is possible to assume where the Russian command plans to enter the western part, and most likely the offensive will be in the near future. The Great Taramel will advance through the beam into this part. That is, to try to enter Timiryazov Street from this place, in order to continue there, or to make a decision where to move further, closer to the dry pits, or to the west in the direction of Praskovia and K. Konstantinovka. Here on these frames, which were published on the 2nd of April, we see how the temporary deployment point was destroyed by an artillery strike, and a little to the east. Today published footage of sunbursts striking this area, that is, we see the density of fire. And we can assume that this is really artillery training, and literally tomorrow the whole story is already possible. Or maybe now, and it will be decided on the final control over Timiryazov Street, further west in the direction of Vodian. It is also worth noting here the summary of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, which reported that over the past day, it was possible to defeat the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. And so the MEB in the area of the settlement of Vodyanaya, and among other things, improved their positions along the front edge. I confirm from geolocation. There is geolocation confirming this literally yesterday, if you remember. We discussed this video with you on the very beginning of the forest belt. Turns out, the Russian gunners are striking, and we assumed that they were striking at the entrance to the trench, so that the stormtroopers could move freely from the northern part of this trench to the south, in the direction of the Sweetwater Road. And just yesterday we discussed this strike, this video, and already today, information is being received about strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine on this forest belt, which confirms the fact that this forest belt has been completely cleared during the fighting over the past few days. Control has been established. That is, here you can see the footage of the movement of Russian fighters and the artillery working on them. That is, right now it is already 100% confirmed bridgehead, and we see that the Russian army is moving further, or trying to move west, in the direction of routes 05, 24 Konstantinovka Ugvadian Uglidar, but among other things. Another day, for the third or fourth day in a row, the Russian command publishes footage of Uglidar itself. Now everything that can pour has started to pour here again. There is a very high density of strikes, and it is difficult to assume what kind of goal the Russian command is pursuing, or to make it clear that there will be offensives in the near future, or preparations are really underway for an offensive. And, yes, well, in the first and in the second case, one conclusion can be drawn. There is an attempt to force the APU to keep operational reserves in the area of Uglidar, since if Court loses Ugald as a result of some unexpected attack, and they fail. Let's say they try to stretch the reserves as between Konstantinovka, between Novomykhailovka, and as a result, if they don't collect them to a heap in one place, miss a blow to the coal mine, then in general it is generally here. Well, as much as possible, the rapid development of events will begin, and of course, in favor of the Russian Federation. That is, we are following the coal fire for the fourth day in a row. The activity of aviation Fabs and Sons means something, of course. And then, we go with you to the South Donetsk direction, in the area of Velikaya Novosolovka. Here, the second, which east is already the third or fourth day. Fighting continues on the southern outskirts of the harvest. After the first unsuccessful attempt, which took several days, the Russian army is regrouping. A large number of AFU positions, anti-tank positions, warehouses, well, everything that can be found, everything was discovered during that attack. I understand that the Ukrainians have fully revealed all their positions. They have shown, and now for the last day, they have been practicing Fabs, practicing sunbursts, but also based on these frames, based on this intensity, it can be assumed that since ground assaults have already begun, these assaults will resume again in the near future. Even more forces, and the main task will be the Russian army at the first stage of the offensive. Let's say a counter-offensive on the harvest. This is of course to completely take control of all farms. There is a fairly convenient bridgehead here. The farms themselves are very convenient to defend. These buildings are small, massive, and further from here, it will be possible to try to move along the main central street, and further north towards Blagodotno. But it is most likely not to rely on a single day, but in general, as if there is activity. And there is an assumption that it will be so. In Novodanilovka, in Zaporozhye, what is interesting here? If you remember, just yesterday we discussed the ultra-high concentration of strikes and padrons of the armed forces of Ukraine on the positions of the Russian army between Kapani, Rivne and Chistopol. Here it was, we see a large number of geolocations. We have assumed that most likely some kind of shock fist of the armed forces of the Russian Federation is concentrated here, and have made the assumption that in the coming days we should expect most likely an intensification of hostilities in this direction. Literally today already, there are a few, let's say 10 hours after we made this assumption, information began to arrive that Russian troops resumed the offensive in the direction of Kapani Novodanilovka, and during the fighting, the Russian army managed to establish control over several additional forest belts in the direction of the settlement. During the day, the armed forces of the Russian Federation established. Well, they have already installed it. Control is constantly established. They struck at attempts, let's say supplies. Some evacuation vehicles along the Highway 0408 Novodanilovka Rabotina, and everything that tried to move was beaten up, destroyed and achieved. That is, the front has moved here. It is difficult to assume after this result that the Russian army becomes or will continue to move on, but in any case, even with this position, it is very difficult to develop further. In the difficult direction of the situation, in working on the highway has already been physically cut. There are still some routes in the fields, but I remind you that simultaneously with the onset of Kapaninev-Danilovka is always daily the Verbovanovo-Danilovka offensive is also underway in the fields. That is, here the situation is slowly and surely going to the point that soon we will forget the word work in general, and perhaps such settlements as Novodanilovka, and perhaps Orekovo itself, will begin to flash in the reports.